Welcome back to the shop, friends. So if you follow me on Instagram, you know I finished my end grain cutting boards I was working on. And I'll be honest with you, I learned a ton. And today I'm going to share with you 10 things that I learned building my first end grain cutting boards. Stick around. If you're new here, my name is Jim and I'm the creator of the Lasting Build channel. I post weekly hobby woodworking videos to help you better your skills and get inspired for that next project. So here's a quick look at the cherry end grain cutting board we just finished, and here is a look at the walnut one. Now, to get something useful from today's video, you need to understand there's 3 different types of cutting boards folks make. Number 1 is a face grain cutting board, number 2 is an edge grain cutting board, and number 3 is a end grain cutting board. A face grain cutting board is similar to this pizza pill that I made last year. It is made up of several wide boards and the face of the grain is showing out. Of all the cutting boards, I think this is probably the most simplistic one that you can make. Now, I don't have an edge grain cutting board to show you right now, but these are some cutoffs from the cherry that I used to make the cutting board. And what I've done is I've put them together showing you the edge. This is the edge of the grain that's showing face out. And that's the part that would show on the finished cutting board, and that's what you'd be cutting against. Then of course the one we're talking about today is the end grain cutting board. And this is where the end grain of the wood is what's facing outward, and that's what you would be cutting your produce or whatever you're cutting on it. It's also, in my opinion, the most difficult to make as well. So the first lesson that I learned in building these 2 small cutting boards is that it takes a lot of material, a lot of stock to build an end grain cutting board. So this cutting board is only about an 8.5 square and this one is around 9 by 12. And to make these 2 cutting boards, it took a large amount of walnut and cherry. So for these 2 cutting boards, I used a piece of walnut about that long and about 8 or 10 inches wide. And then for the cherry, I had some scraps and they were 8 inches wide and about 16 inches long. And I had a couple of those. So if you're thinking about building some end grain cutting boards, be sure you have enough stock on hand before you get started because it takes a lot of wood. That brings me to lesson number 2 that I learned. And to make these end grain cutting boards, it takes a lot of wood because it takes a lot of cutting to get to the final product. You're going to be dimensioning that material on all 6 sides to create that end grain cutting board. First, you're going to create that square piece. You're going to glue those together. Then you're going to cut those and glue them together again. Then you're going to mill it up into its final shape. The third point that I'll make is that it's fairly difficult, at least with the tools that I have, to take all those rough sawn pieces and turn them into really square stock. It's a lot of cutting using just the table saw and the planer, and I did have quite a bit of trouble getting things to be square and perfectly dimensioned. And that brings me to point number 4. I think having a joiner in your shop would make this process much easier. You'd be able to take that rough sawn stock, create that perfectly flat face, and then that perfectly lined up edge to that flat face. Then you could take it through the table saw and cut those pieces into square stock. So point number 5 I want to make is that if you were to want to make a cutting board business, a small business in your home woodworking shop, it would take a lot of equipment to really do it efficiently. You could easily end up using a full-size table saw, full-size joiner, a good-size planer, and to be honest with you, you could also end up using some sort of CNC or something like that. So in order to have a cutting board business that you wanted to actually make efficient and sell some boards and sell a lot of them, you're going to need a fair amount of equipment. Next point that I want to make is that gluing up all these pieces is not that easy. And what I mean by that is that I made this jig to try to help line up at least 2 sides of the boards while they were glued up. But I wasn't really all that happy with the results of the glue ups. It was really tough for me to get those pieces to all line up really nicely. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the cherry board. And if you look really closely, those pieces don't have perfectly straight lines. And as a perfectionist, that drives me a little crazy. It's really kind of the same with the walnut board as well. And if you look right, if you take this line for example, where the glue up is, they're just not perfect. if you notice, the joint just sort of has a sway to it, and that just kind of bugs me to death. So I'm not really sure what the solution is to that problem. I guess it's just practice makes perfect, right? Next time I do these, I'm going to really work hard to try to get those lines to line up really nicely. I'm starting to lose count on which number I'm on, but the next point that I want to make is that pay really close attention to the material that you're using when you're making your end grain cutting board, particularly that end grain, because if there's any soft wood in that cutting board, it's potentially going to harbor some bacteria and could make somebody sick. This is the bottom side of that cherry cutting board, and you can see that punky wood left some of those little holes there, and certainly you wouldn't want to be cutting food on the bottom side of this board, because grime and things can get in there and it'd be really difficult to get out. That's the reason that I put the inlay on the top side of the cherry cutting board to take care of that. That brings me to the next point. Adding an inlay to your cutting board is a really, really nice addition to the board. It really sets it off and makes it unique. But I can tell you, it's a lot of work to do that, and it's pretty hard to get that inlay in there without any gaps between the main board surface and then the inlay. I can tell you that, and I don't have a CNC machine obviously, but if you had one, having adding inlays to your board would become a lot easier. And if you were doing this to sell, wanting to be efficient, I think that'd be the way to go. So the next thing that I learned, and I apologize, I had a bit of a video malfunction. I didn't get to show this part in our series that we made of building these end grain cutting boards, but when you start sanding the surface, if you'll take once you get about halfway sanded, so I did like an 80 grit, 100 grit, 120 grit, if you take some water and you rub the surface of the board, it actually lifts the grain. And then you go through the process of 120 and then maybe 220, and it leaves the smoothest surface that you ever feel. I mean, this surface is so smooth it almost feels like I hand planed it. That method, using just a moist rag to kind of wetten the surface and then let it dry and then sand it, worked so well. So Arrow was in the backyard barking during the video, so if you heard some barking, you know why, but I had to bring him in so he quit barking. But anyhow, this is Arrow, and as we progress in our shop work, I hope he will be able to share some time in the shop with us. He's only 1 year old, so he's still kind of learning to behave. But anyhow, Arrow, say hi to everybody. So the last point that I want to make is that building an end grain cutting board is a ton of work. And I mentioned that earlier, but the appearance of the end grain is really unparalleled. This board, well, both of these boards really look so much better than any of the boards I've ever made before. And I have made both edge grain boards and face grain boards in the past as well. But these boards, man, they're really beautiful. Even all the errors that I made and all the things that I learned, I'm still really proud of them. And I think the ones that I'm going to make in the future will be, even better. So the only thing I have left to do on these cutting boards before wrapping them up for Christmas is to put some rubber feet on them. And I'll show you guys how to do that probably on the next video. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about making these cutting boards, I'll send you over to this video series I made here, and that just goes through some of the key portions of making these boards. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.